I'd like to welcome all of you to this really illustrious panel today. You are likely all here because you are interested in technology and education, and particularly how the former can help us really realize the latter. Because we are here today to discuss the role of technology in accelerating high quality learning at the scale and the level of impact that is direly needed, particularly for children across the globe. My name is Lea Steinacker. I'm a researcher and journalist, and I'm the co-founder of Ada Learning, an edtech platform that is focused on digital competencies. But today we are really focused on our panelists. So first up, we have the initiator of today's conversation, Sir Tony Blair, who was, of course, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and is now the executive chairman of the Tony Blair Institute of Global Change. First of all, welcome to you, Prime Minister Blair.
Thank you very much, Lea. Great to have everyone on this. I see we're now getting over 200, so that's great. Big welcome to Minister David Sengeh, and hopefully Paula Ingabire's coming. She's got a few problems at the airport, but she's sorting those out. And welcome to everybody. This is an opportunity to discuss in general education and technology, but also specifically our proposal for what we call a World Education Service in order to facilitate the use of technology in educating young people around the world. Back to you, Lea.
Thank you, Prime Minister Blair. And you already mentioned it. We are, of course, also thrilled to be joined by Dr. David Moinina Sengeh. He is the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and the Chief Innovation Officer of Sierra Leone. Welcome to you, Minister Sengeh, as well.
Thank you.
And hopefully we have now, just this second, also been joined by Her Excellency Paula Ingabire. She is the Minister of Information and Communications Technology and Innovation of Rwanda. Minister Ingabire has been having some traveling issues, but I will now just ask, can you hear us, Minister Ingabire? Because I can see your name.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Welcome. Very, very happy to have you. That is perfect timing. See, technology does help sometimes. So given the collective expertise here, let's use the next about 40 minutes to dive a little deeper. And we'll start off by understanding where we are at today. We are actually at the half point between 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed upon, and 2030, which is a very important year in terms of the SDG targets. And most people would probably agree that we are not really on track, particularly to meet the SDG number 4. The goal back then, just to remind you all, was to have over 270 million more children in school by 2030 than we did in 2015. And by current trends, that is actually a goal that we are not reaching at all. The world is likely to fall short by more than 100 million places. So I will start off with you, Prime Minister Blair. Why is universal access to quality education such an important issue to start with? Why does it matter so much?
Well, it's very obvious education is the great liberator, right? Without education, particularly in today's world where things are changing very fast, where there's a premium on creativity, knowledge, interpersonal skills. Without access to education, there's not access to opportunity. So as you rightly say, Lea, we're well short of meeting the SDG goals at the moment. And the question is, how can technology bridge this gap? And technology, in our view, has a role to play in this way. That if you what we call the sort of education trilemma are the challenges of the quality of education, scaling it to the whole of a nation, and the cost. And technology can help with all three of those. It can help with the quality, because we should have education being able to access the best technological tools for educating our young people. There are lots of examples today of education, frankly, being better done online than often in the classroom. But certainly it can be a great assistance to teachers. It can allow you to scale, because it can get a lot more people, with the access to the education they need. And then finally, it can also help with costs, because, the costs of education rise exponentially, and it's very difficult for countries often to manage to get the quality at the cost they can afford. So for all of those reasons, I think it's the right endeavor to see how we facilitate and help that process of using technology to accelerate learning.
Absolutely. Let's look at some of the local contexts to really understand the more local challenges, and then also what you just mentioned, Prime Minister Blair, the opportunities that we might tap into with tech. I'd love to ask you, Minister Ingabire, what are some of the main barriers to universal secondary school completion in your country, in Rwanda?
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure connecting with all of you. I'll quickly respond to your question, Leah. I think a couple of barriers, and perhaps which will possibly not unique just to Rwanda, but to various countries, is one is around access. And I'll probably have three buckets of challenges or barriers. One is around access in terms of cost, affordability, for many households to be able to afford quality education. But also the second one is around the quality of teachers, the competencies and proficiencies, because in many countries, what you'll see and what is also similar to Rwanda is that continuous investment that has to be made to upskill and reskill the teachers and people that are contributing to the quality of education. Then the third, which in a way we've also been able to address over time, had always been around the high dropout rates, especially in the lower sections of secondary school, where for many, given whether you'd like to look at it at the income levels or any other challenges that they may be facing, the learning gaps, obviously, that start at a very, what we term as learning poverty, that starts at a very, lower age, and over time, students have difficulties catching up or coping with the lessons. And so I feel like those are some of the barriers around universal secondary school completion. But it's not all. I would also not want to just focus on the barriers. It's also to say that there's work that is being done. Also wearing my tech hat, what are some of the things that can be done to really bridge the gaps that we continue to see, whether it's the use of technology in addressing peer learning, whether it's the online training, as we've gone through, 2 to 3 years of COVID-19, we've seen, a huge need for adopting digital technologies, digital tools and platforms, both for the teachers and for students, so that they can close on those learning gaps, but also they can be able to really benefit beyond the classroom environment. And so looking at the investments that we continue to make as the government of Rwanda, from one, skilling teachers with digital literacy skills, it starts with them, providing them with devices and ensuring that they're able to leverage all these digital technologies to fast track and close on the learning gaps. But also, I think what we also need to be looking at is, and this is an initiative that we continue to work on with various stakeholders, is the school connectivity program. And of course, that is really catering for when students are at school. Countries like Rwanda will continue to also invest in last mile connectivity, because when students go back home, how then do they continue to really benefit from the different tools and platforms that have been put in place? And I think when you look at what the Tony Blair initiative is really trying to do around the World Education Service, I think it really closes, the gap and helps close the gap around access, because the key thing has always been around affordability, around infrastructure. And I think we'll look at that over the next few minutes, how this is going to be beneficial, but also what would be the role of governments and different other stakeholders to contribute to having impact at scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very substantial roundup of both the barriers and the opportunities, really, that lie in tech. Now, some people have criticisms about, sort of throwing tech at any issue, specifically education. Some might say this replaces teachers. Mr. Sengeh, why would you still say no? There is potential. You are somebody who is, like Minister Ingabire and Prime Minister Blair, a huge champion of using tech. How do you relate to those kinds of criticisms?
It's very interesting. As I like to blend things usually for my understanding. And one of those was SDG 4 and SDG 5, so quality education, but also with gender equity and quality and equality merge. But one is tech and equity. So I think, so techquity. The idea here is actually when people think about technology, they generally imagine, and this has been true if you don't do it well, that it further widens the gap. But the way we are approaching this is technology can be what we can use to shut in the gap, to close the gap. How do we use technology to address issues of inequity? How do we use technology to drive equity? You know, when Paula spoke about access and quality and connectivity and all of those things, which are really important. It's important for us to know that technology has a role to address those barriers, particularly in delivering equity. So one example is, and the way to drive that, I think, really is around what we in Sierra Leone are calling the hybrid use of technology. And I like to often start by saying paper is technology. Yeah. So if you're thinking about from paper to you think about the spaceship, you think about the metaverse, you think about pen, they're all different forms. And I think the key for us is how do we ensure that quality education is being accessed by everybody. So when we started in Sierra Leone, President Bio had a free quality school education, and I was named Chief Innovation Officer. And I remember being on the radio a lot and talking about education and technology and innovation. And people said, "Oh, come on, you guys, you're living in a different planet. How can you be talking about technology and innovation when people can't read or write, or when we don't have basic things?" And the president kept talking to me about explaining what data means and what those solutions are. But ultimately, it's about solving a problem. Today, and I'll talk about the service, one of those services, there's nowhere the president goes. So the president goes everywhere, and he often gives the chief, the local leader, 3 minutes or 5 minutes to say something. And every chief in this country will say, "Your Excellency, I want to thank you for the technology solution that you developed for us to be able to check our results." And now you can go anywhere in this country. You're wealthy, you're poor, you live in Freetown, you live in Falaba, up north. Every child has access to an SMS-enabled platform with which they can check their results, with which they can know which school they are being placed to, with which they can have access to learning materials. Now, it's not the final answer, but when you deploy technology to address equity. And for us, we use the principle of radical inclusion to make sure that everybody, particularly those who are historically marginalized, are addressed for. Then you're able to build a system that now, as Tony was saying, addresses the question of quality, scale, and cost. The cost to government, the cost to parents and the children, and it's the same service for everybody. And so for us in Sierra Leone, for areas where there's no connectivity, even cellular connectivity, we have about 90% coverage. But in places where there's no cellular connectivity and where it's really poor, we provide paper, we print paper and quality materials and send it to those hard to reach areas. Where there's radio, we use radio for distance teaching, teacher training, and making sure that teachers are not leaving their classrooms and their communities to go to central places for training. So using radio for both teacher training and using radio for continuous learning in school. I think Paula also mentioned something really important, that how do you have continuous learning when people go home? And we saw the impact of COVID. And then I mentioned the SMS solution for result checker. And most importantly as well, one of the things that, we take the dictionary for granted, but yet everybody does spell check. You can't write a document without Microsoft Word automatically spell checking for you, and we use it. But we take it for granted, and many of us grew up reading the dictionary. And today, every child, everybody in this country has access to a USSD enabled platform where they can check the meaning of any word. And these obviously then increases literacy. And certainly, finally, on the high end of the spectrum, on the digital, we have the learning passports that we do with UNICEF and Microsoft and several entities, where we can have offline, online solutions where children can access content all the way from materials to examination. So this tequity, I hadn't thought about it until you asked me the question. Really, that merges technology and equity is one of the things that I'm excited about. I think in terms of what the service that Tony was talking about earlier is really important, and it's exciting for us.
I actually love that we are coming up with new terms in this session. Tequity, you heard it here first. Very much appreciate that. Also, I really appreciate that Minister Ingabire is now joining us even with video. Thank you so much. We are aware that you're still traveling. So again, technology makes it possible that the government of Rwanda is represented even while traveling by car. So as you can see in the chat, we posted a link to what Minister Ingabire has just mentioned and what Prime Minister Blair also mentioned at the very beginning, which is the proposal for a World Education Service. So if you want to check it out, obviously feel free to do that right after the session. You can find the link in the chat right now. So we just heard some examples from Rwanda, from Sierra Leone. Prime Minister Blair, I would love to hear from you. What are the examples that really have struck you, where you have seen technology, even in settings where we might have a lack of infrastructure or missing connectivity, where you really say this is where we should focus on in bringing technology to the world of learning? What are some of the examples that struck you?
Yeah, so I mean, we've actually had a really interesting hearing Paula and David talk about the practical uses, because in the end, technology is just a tool. Mm-hmm. I mean, it depends how you use it then as to whether it does good or bad. But when people say to me, well, how does technology? I mean, surely education's not about technology. Education is vital, but it can be delivered well or badly. And if you have a tool that allows you to deliver it better, well, it would be sensible to use it. So the types of things that I've come across are things like, David was just alluding to it, where people can get assessments very quickly, where they can access different learning tools, where they can accumulate data in a much more effective way. And then, of course, you've got individual companies that are now starting who are developing really imaginative ways of learning. And, I know we got many of these types of companies on the webinar today, but, you've got an explosion of edtech companies, and they're offering a service that if governments learn about and learn how to utilize them, can augment the normal system of teaching. And one of the things I think that's really important, this is where I think being able to use some of the technology to have more creative, imaginative ways of teaching. One of the problems that I've seen in different parts of the world is that you can enroll more children in school, but you don't necessarily, that's not the same as getting them educated. So a lot of children, frankly, are enrolled in school without the quality of education. So they're not coming out at the end of the schooling with anything that's very useful to them. So again, technology can be of assistance in helping that, because you can bring the very best of teaching into the classroom. Now, what is absolutely true, and you alluded to this earlier, Lea, is there are countries where you don't have the internet access, right? Now, again, my institute's working on a whole lot of different ways that we can facilitate that. And of course, it's really important, as Paula was saying, that you get that extra, that end-mile connectivity. But we've got technology there again can help. The satellite technology should allow us to connect people much more easily, especially if, I mean, obviously you need electricity to be able to connect to the internet. But again, technology in its broader sense can help here. But if governments know what is available from a technology point of view to help them, and this is the whole purpose of the World Education Service, And if they've got the systems in government and the skills in government that allow them to access that properly, there's a whole range of things from the way the school system is administered to what's taught in the classroom that can be transformed. And one of the great things about, the world today, and I always say this to the governments we work with, and we work with about 35 different governments around the world, is someone somewhere has got the same problem as you, and they're probably solving it. So one of the important things is also to bring in the best ideas that you have. And if, back in government today, there's no point in just staying in your own narrow lane. Look at what is happening elsewhere in the world. Look at some of the things that are coming through that are really important. Look, for example, at how you can use data, to reimagine the way that you operate your system. And the combination of all those things is absolutely transformative. And what we're about in the end, I think it's really important we always keep the focus on this. It's about, at the end of it, producing the young student that's going to come out with the knowledge they need and the skills they need to be able to face this world. And this is what is, and technology, in the end, is just a tool for doing it. But like in so many other walks of life, the scale of technological advance is unlike anything we've known, before, really. I mean, it's artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all of this is going to change the world in such a dramatic way. And our job is to understand that world and then access its opportunities.
So before we actually jump into the proposal of a World Education Service, which you set up really nicely, Prime Minister Blair, now to jump into the details, I'd just love to get one more, well, one might say criticism out of the way, especially since both Minister Ingabire and Minister Sengeh actually have a tech background, right? You're both actually technologists by training. Minister Ingabire, Prime Minister Blair just mentioned quantum technology, artificial intelligence. These are all the big technologies. You're a champion of blockchain technology. You're really deeply in the tech field. So I'm wondering, what is your take on the question of why hasn't tech helped us solve this problem up until now? We've been having lots of technologies emerging. All these big platforms are out there. Some might say it hasn't done enough yet. What has happened up until now?
Thank you, Lea. And perhaps I could answer it in two ways. One, context always matters. And we see that especially, I hope you can hear me very clearly, great. So context always matters, and we also see it with different applications that work somewhere and do not necessarily create the same results elsewhere. And when we're talking about education, I think one of the things that we always have to also be mindful of is the language of instruction, of access. So you may have all these technologies that can do, all these great things, but at the end of the day, if it's not fit to the context in which it's going to be applied, then there will always be, these uncertainties around, can technology really do this? The second thing is technology on its own will never achieve all these benefits that we've laid out. I think it works hand in hand with everything that you have to put in place, from training people to be able to use the technology and benefit from it, and also even provide feedback that allows you to improve. It's not like a book that you will print and maybe you realize, okay, this content is not the right content. It's going to take us, a whole other effort to start reprinting all this material so that it's accessible to the students and teachers. And so it allows for that ability to be able to quickly fine tune what already exists, but also allow for that wider access. I said this, and I want to perhaps even use a bit of examples. You can imagine you have this great tool where teachers, for example, can use it. They can use scripted lesson plans to deliver quality education in a uniform manner across different parts of our country. But if these same teachers, one, are not trained to use the device to access that platform, two, do not have sufficient bandwidth or capacity, so that in a way they're able to have quality experience as they use the platform to deliver lesson plans. And third, if what I've seen with most of these applications, and this is where I come back to the question around context mattering, if for a teacher who is already struggling with very limited digital required to almost have a dual process of preparing lessons, the traditional way, but also at the same time try to adapt to the use of technology in delivering their lessons. For them, it feels like, it's a double effort. They have to put in double the time to do that. And so the way we integrate technology in a way that it simplifies both the life and processes of a teacher to deliver their lessons, but also simplifies the ability for students to learn, I think that is where we need to get it right. Because if it comes as an added effort to what they're already doing, they don't already have enough hours to prepare and deliver the lessons plan. So they have to put in extra time. Then I think that's where sometimes people feel like technology has failed them, but we've just sort of picked it as a box and placed it in a context and not necessarily figured out what are the behavioral changes that need to happen for adoption to take place at scale and for the impact to be seen.
Yes. Minister Ingabire just said two very important things. You mentioned that it's also very important to, first of all, understand what is already there, what is existing, and how can we bring this together and convene and then facilitate, first of all, access, but also local adaptation. You mentioned local context. I feel like that is exactly one of the core aspects of the World Education Service as you are proposing it, Prime Minister Blair. Would you like to get into a little bit more detail so that we can all understand? Before, I'd love to hear from the ministers how it might apply to their contexts. We'd love to hear what the idea actually is.
Yeah, so the idea of the World Education Service is you have governments and educators here, right? You've got the technology capabilities here, and you want to put the two together. So the purpose of the World Education Service is to create a globally available free service. It would be under the aegis of the United Nations, but run in a, one remove way with people who are capable in the technology and educational sphere. And the purpose would be, as it were, to facilitate the adoption of the best education technology that there is. So it would be helping governments and policymakers understand what is available, how they might implement it, what they would do, for example, as we were just saying, to make sure it's locally adaptable, and to make sure, for example, it's in the right language and in the right setting, in things in ways that are culturally appropriate, and so on. So this would be an international service. It'd be freely available, and frankly, there's a detailed plan that people can go onto the website and look at. The cost is actually a tiny fraction of the over $15 billion that's spent in aid money on education annually, and over $4 trillion worldwide on education itself. So this is quite a low cost, not heavy-handed or bureaucratic way of facilitating and enabling. And the most difficult thing for government, I mean, you've got, if they don't mind me saying, two of the most able ministers on the African continent here with us, and we're very lucky to have them on this webinar. But both of them are people who understand the technology and understand how they might utilize it. It's really important to realize that for a lot of government, and particularly, if I can say it as an older person from an older generation, people don't get it, they don't understand it, and frankly, they're deeply suspicious of it. So one of the things that has to happen is that if you have such a facilitation service, the idea is to build up real practical examples of how this is changing the world, right? And if you think about COVID and what happened during COVID, there were advances both in medical science and in the way we interacted with each other, where we accelerated the process of change by necessity. And one of the things I always think is, what you need to do in government is to take the urgency and the focus that you have in a crisis and apply it to normal life, because that's when you make change, and change that really lasts. And so the idea of this World Education Service is to be, as I say, it's a facilitation, an exchange, which allows us to accelerate that process and to allows countries that are prepared to have an understanding, that bring the right skill set into government, to utilize that in order to transform their education systems and to learn from each other, so that you're not, if something is working in a good way somewhere, then people can take it and use it in another way. And really, this is as much about the processes of government as it is about the processes of technology, which is why it's important to have government ministers familiar with both talking about it.
I think your intergenerational point also really links back nicely to what Minister Ingabire just mentioned in terms of teachers that might already have such a workload in terms of actually pedagogically delivering, and then having the added stress of understanding the technology. And we all have to face the fact that probably there are a bunch of 14-year-olds who are much better at using certain technologies than most people, if I may say that, potentially in government and maybe even teachers. So there is a big translation work to be done. But Minister Sengeh, I'm wondering, national education systems are often so individual, and some of the barriers and opportunities are very much, as Minister Ingabire said, contextual. Why do you think that something like a World Education Service might still be a facilitator and might be, at a good level if it's an international cooperation like that?
Look, this is amazing and exciting, and what the world needs. So the first question you'd asked at the start of this conversation was, I think you asked Tony about that we're not going to meet the SDGs. It's not just an assumption. When countries self-report from the benchmarks, I'm the chair of the GEM report, the Global Education Monitoring Report, that does the benchmarks with UIS UNESCO. Countries by themselves, their benchmarks and their targets will not meet that. So we, the countries, have accepted that we're not going to, right? And it's not an element of ambition. It's not like we have lower ambition. There's I think as Paula was saying, context does matter. But I think it's because we are not thinking about innovation and really transformative ideas as this one. So 2 examples, which the question that you asked Paul earlier as well. Look, I was at the MIT Media Lab and we did a lot of technology and AI for education. But when we're thinking about what's happening with your skin's conductance and your emotion and your sleep and how you're going to affect your learning in class based on who you are, that's how people talked about AI and education before. And we talked about it in Boston, Massachusetts, MIT. Or when people spoke about EdTech before, it wasn't with Prime Minister Blair, Minister Paula from Rwanda, and Minister Sengeh from Sierra Leone. No, it was talked about by other people who probably had ties and suits and were all male, sitting in some boardroom in London, or what is happening here is why things are different now. Because you have Tony, you have Paula, you have David, and talking about how technology and how AI and how digitization can transform education. 2-3 years ago, I collaborated with a researcher from South Africa who was mentoring a student from Uganda to develop an AI system for education that told us, using all the education data in Sierra Leone, what were the variables that were affecting student outcomes using all of our annual school census. Now, governments can make a policy change based on the value and the impact of female toilets, how female toilets affected learning outcomes of girls around the different parts of the community. It's not about my skin conductance and my sleep is important and my own personal individualized learning for what I learn. But as a government, and when we think about equity, it's about the system and what policies. So that's a major difference now, in addition to what Paula had said. But to answer your question, why this is exciting is when COVID happened, what happened? Paula is amazing. She and Gaspard will develop their own e-learning solution for Rwanda. The UK will spend tens of millions of dollars to develop their own e-learning solution for their children. In America, every state develops their own solution for e-learning. UAE develops an amazing system. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by countries to develop the same system, to do the same thing, and at different levels of success. It is crazy that the world did not sit down and think, okay, 1.6 billion of our children are not in school. Instead of this mad rush of, okay, everybody build the system here, 10 million, everybody build the system. And I'm on the GPE board and I engage GPE. If you look at the grants that GPE gave out, technology and digital platforms for each country were there. And if you look at what the World Bank did as well, and with the support, lots of monies, and every country is developing edtech solutions for learning. And I think what Tony and what this is telling us, what we really should be doing, look, ultimately the issues that Paula mentioned around context and as well around learning and language and being able to plug and play, ultimately literacy, the best content for ECD learning should be available for all of us. And it should be such that I can plug and play, figure out my context, figure out my teachers, ensure the connectivity is there and all of those things are there to ensure that our children learn. And yes, we started from the point about how we may not meet the SDG 4, but I think going up into the Transforming Education Summit, and maybe if we have time, I'll mention it later on, given the role that we're playing. So she said, no. It should not be acceptable for us to just be okay with countries by their benchmarks. They're not going to meet SDG 4. We have time. Let's ask for these transformational, innovative ideas. Let's go back, look at all the different components, and let's accelerate towards meeting these targets. I think it's possible, but it requires us to think differently and work across the border. So while countries have specific solutions, I will tell you, and it's not because Paula is on here, but the collaboration that is happening on the continent in Africa, the collaboration that's happening with institutions like CBI, the collaborations that's happening within the UNESCO framework, within what the Secretary General is trying to do this summer at the Transforming Education Summit are what we need to make sure that we can hit our targets. So I'm really excited about this opportunity as one of the, one of the action tracks on digital transformation. And I think it's important that we're talking up ideas about how we can meet the digital transformation goals within how we transform education for everybody.
Your excitement really emanates. I can feel it through the Zoom call. It's fantastic. Prime Minister Blair, how do we make sure that governments actually radically rethink education in the way that is necessary, just like Minister Ingabire and Minister Sengeh are exemplifying today? I mean, you have interacted with a lot of heads of states in your time. How is that possible? Because it sounds like it's quite a different stance. These two are really far ahead.
Well, it's best done by example, by showing people what is actually working. And one thing that I have noticed, and this is a byproduct of COVID as well, is that the presidents and prime ministers that we're working with are much more attuned to what technology can do. So I have a quite different quality of conversation around things like data and data infrastructure and data centers than I did 4 or 5 years ago, for example. So, but the short answer, Lea, is the best thing to do, and this is why you need a sort of a hub that helps facilitate. The best thing is by example, by saying, look, this is what, this is what Rwanda, this is what Sierra Leone are doing, this is how they've done it. You can do it too. It's not that complicated, really. And by also providing a connector for the ed tech companies themselves, because there are some great and interesting companies out there. I mean, I see a lot of them all the time, and one of the things my institute does is we specifically try and facilitate the introduction of technology into countries, and it could be in education, could be in healthcare, it could be in agriculture, whatever it is. But so for a lot of the technology companies, just as there's an ignorance from government about technology, so to be very blunt about it, there's often an ignorance about government from the technology sector. And I think there's, I would say there's less hostility. It's less about hostility, which I don't meet very often, sometimes, but not that often. It's more really just about knowledge, and then about how you make the system work. What do you do? What are the first steps? Because it's all very well to have the idea, but then, okay, what is the process of implementation? Who are the people in government that are going to help that? What is the actual practical set of steps that is going to deliver this? So these are the things I think we need to concentrate on.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately. So I would love to end on really concrete ideas, because I would love for the audience to not just take away this very big idea of the World Education Service, and we do hope that you all read up on it afterwards. I would love for them to walk away with some really tangible things to remember and some tangible next steps. So if I may ask you for a sort of last quick fire round, what if you were in the position to appeal to the other governments of the world, to the edtech companies, to NGOs, what are the next concrete steps? I'll start with you, Minister Ingabire. What would be your tangible to-dos?
Thank you again, Lea. I think a couple of things I would put out, especially because earlier in my very first intervention, I talked about what the role, what our individual and collective role is going to be, whether it's the government, the private sector, the edtech entrepreneurs, the teachers as well, and students. I think we have a great opportunity to co-create solutions together. And there's something that what I touched on earlier, I didn't get the opportunity. I've been asked a couple of questions. Especially as we went through COVID, we've had a massive wealth of information, but also a massive number of entrepreneurs that are building edtech solutions. And so whether it's governments or schools, everyone is confused on, okay, which is a better solution for the kind of needs that I may already have in place. But also as a government, and I would imagine even for David, it's the same, you always want to empower as many entrepreneurs and innovators as possible. But if you have solutions that are overlapping, that are siloed, then it becomes difficult to do that. And which is why I talk about co-creation, even leveraging what Tony and the team are doing with the World Education Service, which is really how do we co-create solutions with these local entrepreneurs, with the schools, to understand where their gaps and needs are, so that in the end, what we have in place is something that is a good fit for the local problems that we are trying to address. The second thing I would also look at, again, while we will be having this platform where you can get free access to education content, I think a key thing that is very important that we need also to mobilize supported partnerships around is ensuring that you have that last mile connectivity in homes, in schools, in communities, places where students can go to and access this content. Devices are still a problem in this part of the world. Expensive. A household would probably never afford it if they have to pay an upfront cost for it. And so I think as we look at this platform with its ability to provide access to these learning materials, it's the partnerships that need to be forged around other aspects of access, which is the infrastructure, which is the devices, and most importantly, the digital literacy skilling that is so essential, because they may have the devices, they may have high connectivity and have access to such platforms, but if they're still struggling to navigate them, then it's not a full circle of solving the problem. So I feel even as we go away from this, and these are things that were already being done, but we need scale. We need skill in many ways. It's things that governments want to do on their own. Schools cannot afford to do this on their own. The entrepreneurs have solutions. They're looking for someone to bet on them and believe in them. But I think if we are able to look at it from these different lenses, provide scale, but also grow the private sector at the same time.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Sengeh, what about your concrete steps?
I think three things. Think open source, create together, as Paula said, and share. And now we have a platform and an avenue and an invitation for how we do that. The second one is think radical inclusion. We have to build for equity. Technology must drive equity. Technology must not be seen as something that will further create a gap, but we should deploy it such that it brings on board equity. And finally, think hybrid. I think from the pen to the spaceship, from a book to the metaverse, we must ensure that all learners have access to quality education. So let's accelerate towards the SDG 4 and let's transform education.
Here's to that. And finally, Prime Minister Blair, what about your next steps?
Well, first of all, Lea, thank you very much for hosting this. Thank you very much to David and Paula for contributing such excellent insights. And Paula, thank you particularly given your problems. You've been bouncing around quite a lot in that car. I think you need to get those roads fixed in Lisbon. We'll put that on the agenda too.
I think so.
But
the roads in Kigali are much better.
I think they probably are actually. So mine is very, very simple. I think we should do this World Education Service, but my one plea is don't make it a typical UN agency, with the greatest respect. Make it something agile with the right skill set and a real spirit of enterprise about it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all very, very much. First of all, also to the audience, thank you for your time. This concludes our session. And please make sure you actually have a look at the proposal for the World Education Service. But of course, a very big thank you to the three of you, Prime Minister Blair and Ministers Ingabire and Minister Sengeh. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.